Hey everybody, my name is Grant, and welcome to a new series for this channel, The History of the Jewish People. In this series, I'm going to be recounting the history of the Jewish people, from their prehistoric origins to the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And in this episode, we're going to be covering the former of those 2 points. I would also like to mention that this video was made in tandem with fellow indie YouTuber Mr. B, who made a video about why the Jews have been so hated throughout world history. So when you're done with this video, make sure you go and check out his. So where exactly did the Jews come from? Well, there are many theories on the matter, so let's start with the one you're probably most familiar with. The story begins with the biblical patriarch Abraham, who came from the city of Ur. We don't know exactly where Ur was, but most archaeologists believe it was somewhere in Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq. Abraham was spoken to by God, who told him that he had a promised land for him out west in the land of Canaan. God made a covenant with Abraham, promising him that he would be the father of many nations. But Abraham, along with his wife Sarah, were very old, and so they didn't quite buy into God's promise of children. So Sarah tried to fulfill the promise on her own with her slave or servant, depending on translation, Hagar. And with Hagar, he had his first son, Ishmael. However, he eventually would have a son with his wife Sarah, who would be named Isaac. And these 2 parts of his family did not get along. There was a lot of tension. The 2 sons would have to compete for their father's inheritance. Well, Sarah wasn't having any of that. And so she demanded that Abraham kick Hagar and Ishmael out of their tribe, group, or whatever they were calling it. And God acquiesced to this. And so the 2 of them were banished. Ishmael and Hagar go into the wilderness, which many believe to be somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, making Ishmael the father of the Arab peoples. And after being nearly sacrificed by Abraham, Isaac would go on to have his own son Jacob, whom God renamed Israel. Jacob would have 12 sons, who would become the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. One of the sons, Joseph, was Jacob's favorite, and so he got a snazzy coat, and all of his brothers were jealous. So they stole his coat, sold him into slavery into Egypt, and told their father that he was killed. As a slave in Egypt, Joseph worked until he became second in command. At this point, his brothers had had to flee the land of Canaan from a famine and to find food in Egypt. After some tricks and tough love, Joseph revealed to his brothers that he had been alive the whole time. He invited his family to live with him in Egypt, which is where the story of Exodus picks up. But that's beyond the scope of this episode. So what does our friend Josephus have to say about this event? Yeah, so most historians have a hard time taking the Old Testament at face value as a historical source. But contrary to popular opinion, it's not because it has supernatural explanations for events. The Jews are far from the only people having those. What makes it difficult is that there aren't any corroborating sources agreeing with what the Jews say. Basically, no one from the time period in which Abraham lived mentioned him existing. On the one hand, this critique could simply be written off as, that's a long time ago, and it's not likely other people would have heard of him, or if they had, they wouldn't have thought he was important at all. After all, he was just some guy who left his home city in Mesopotamia and settled somewhere else. Why take any note of him? On the other hand, we could ask ourselves, if Abraham became so important later on, why then didn't other peoples try to incorporate him into their own national narratives later? The biggest problem with historical origin stories like this is that they rely on the historicity of individuals from time periods where there isn't much historical evidence for anyone living at the time. You have similar issues with the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. Ultimately, the story of Abraham and the other patriarchs are non-falsifiable. You can't really prove it, but you can't disprove it either, so we're kind of stuck on that front. But what about other explanations for their origins? Well, there are a few theories. One method is the linguistic approach. This is an attempt to trace the origins of a people by looking at their language and finding common roots with other languages. For centuries, Christian writers recognized similarities between Hebrew, Arabic, Phoenician, and other Near Eastern languages. It wasn't until the late 18th century that European scholars actually created a classification for these languages, for which the German scholar Ludwig von Scholz coined the term Semitic, which is derived from the name Shem, who is the son of Noah from whom the Bible says Abraham is descended. As the Europeans began to get more involved in the Near East, they uncovered more and more similarities between Hebrew and other regional languages. In the latter half of the 19th century, the works of linguists and archaeologists uncovered and translated a set of letters called the Amarna letters, which refer to a group of people as the Habaru. Now, you don't have to be a linguist to notice that the names Habaru and Hebrew sound very similar, and many scholars at the time believed that they had found the origin of the Jews this way. The Amarna letters were a series of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptians and subordinate Canaanite kings. In these letters, they complained about a group of people called the Habaru. The Habaru were described as nomadic outsiders who attacked and robbed cities. Most of the letters were from Canaanite kings asking the Egyptians to help defend themselves against the outsiders. These letters were dated to sometime between the 15th and 13th centuries BCE, which many historians and archaeologists believe may have been the time period in which the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan. These connections became the basis for the Habaru Hebrew theory, but it doesn't come without its problems. First of all, in the letters, the Habaru are not described as an ethnic or religious group, but rather as more of a social class, a group of people who refuse to subordinate themselves to local rulers. Some have argued that this could mean that the Hebrews originated not as an ethnic group, but rather as a discriminated social class. However, this becomes a little more difficult to justify when you see the term Habaru was used in more than just Canaan. There were Habaru all over the Near East, which makes it a little harder for a single group of people to have claimed the title for themselves. There's also the assumption being made that Habaru and Hebrew must be related because they sound similar. Now, I personally am not too knowledgeable about linguistics, but people who are far more knowledgeable than me have said that this very likely could be a case of false cognates, or two words that sound similar but have completely different origins. The history of the Habaru Hebrew theory is also somewhat problematic, because you see, around the same time this theory was being developed, in neighboring fields, they were also developing the Aryan theory. And in case you're curious, yes, I'm referring to the Aryan theory that became the basis for Nazi race ideology. Linguists in the 19th century believed that the language of a people reflects the nature of their people. The ancient Aryan language was seen as powerful and dynamic, while Semitic languages were seen as conservative and against change. These 19th century linguists and ethnographers believed that the peoples of Europe are descended from a group of Central Asian Aryans, from whom the Europeans inherited their ability to dominate the world. The description of the Habaru as nomads who stole from people and refused to conform to norms of local peoples also played into many stereotypes of Jewish people that the Europeans had had for centuries. The Jews were portrayed as landless people who were destined to be nomads forever. They also saw the Habaru affinity for pillaging as the behavioral origin for Jewish moneylending. However, any competent historian will tell you that this was a profession forced on Jews by European Christians. The scholars from these two theories built their ideas on much of the research from the other. The Aryan theory was discredited by the Nazis in World War II, but the Habaru Hebrew theory has retained some of its clout because it wasn't nearly as widespread at the time. However, it should be noted that just because some people found justification for their anti-Semitism in the Habaru doesn't mean that there aren't any connections between the Jewish people and the Habaru as described in the Amarna letters. Many biblical and Jewish studies scholars hold the Habaru as being one of many potential ancestors to the Israelites. A more commonly accepted origin for the Jews today is that rather than being an outside people who invaded and conquered the land of Canaan, that they themselves were Canaanites who either saw themselves as being different from the rest of the Canaanites or who purposely differentiated themselves from the rest of the Canaanites. Some like to refer to these Canaanites as Proto-Israelites. These Proto-Israelites would eventually go on to conquer the land of Canaan, renaming it Israel. For most proponents of this theory, the story of Exodus must be completely rejected, which has led to many more Orthodox Jews and conservative Christians rejecting this theory. In contrast to these theories, however, there are some who believe that the ancestry of the Jews is far more recent. When speaking of the ancient Jewish peoples, we are usually referring to the Israelites from the Old Testament. Well, in case you didn't notice, we don't call people Israelites anymore. There are people whom we call Israelis, but that only started after the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Some historians argue that we should differentiate between Israelite and Jew because they are very different things. Most historians would date the beginning of this change with the establishment of Israel under King David and the construction of the Temple of Solomon. Before the temple was built, the Israelite religion was nomadic and had a penchant for slipping into polytheism, as described numerous times in the Old Testament. Historians argue that the establishment of a temple in Jerusalem began to transform the Israelite religion by centralizing its theology and doctrines. The ones who argue this point to the Babylonian exile as the breaking point between when these people transformed from being Israelites to being Jews. They argue that the Jews were created from the exiled leaders of Israel who were forced to relocate to Babylon. Before then, the Israelite religion was based around living in the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. After the exile, the religion became centered around doctrine and social practices that differentiated themselves from the pagans that surrounded them. Now, a lot of this theory delves into material that I want to cover in a later episode. So suffice it to say for now that this theory is not universally accepted. This theory does, however, connect to another area of determining the origins of the Jews, and that is the reliability of the Old Testament sources. In this debate, there are two broad schools of thought. On one hand, there are biblical minimalists who believe that most of what the Old Testament says about the kingdom of Israel is completely fiction. And biblical maximalists who believe that, although not strictly historically accurate, the Old Testament is based on long-standing oral traditions from the Israelites between the 10th and 5th centuries BCE. The biggest area of contention is over the period before the exile. Maximalists hold the position that the biblical narrative should be believed unless explicitly disproven, while minimalists believe that it should not be believed unless explicitly proven. The problem with much of this goes back to what I mentioned before, which is that much of the Old Testament is non-falsifiable. Building on the idea that the Old Testament is not reliable at all as a historical source is a more extreme theory that even most biblical minimalists reject, and that is that modern Jews have absolutely no connection to the Israelites mentioned in the Old Testament. There are numerous proponents of this theory, but the most notable is Shlomo Sand, an Israeli historian at the University of Tel Aviv. In 2008, he published a book titled The Invention of the Jewish People, which argues that the Jews from Europe have no ancestral connection to the Israelites from the Bible. The author believes that modern Jews, especially those from Eastern Europe, are descended from a Turkic tribe between the Black and Caspian Seas that converted to Judaism in the 8th century CE. He also asserts that the Zionist movement of the late 19th century fabricated its historical connection to the Israelites of the Old Testament in order to gain and assert a claim to the land of Palestine. His theory became very popular in the Arab world, being commonly sold side by side with Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which has led many to label his book and the theory to be very anti-Semitic. Sand rejects the concept of a Jewish ethnicity, classifying Jewishness as only a religion. Like all works of history, this book has its own historical context. Israeli society in general, and Israeli academia in particular, are used to hearing scholars, archaeologists, and historians questioning the traditional narratives of their history all the time. They've seen historians rewrite the history of the first Arab-Israeli war that gave the state of Israel its independence, as well as archaeologists claiming that the Davidic kingdom never existed. Given this context, an author needs to make some pretty extreme claims if they want to gain any attention. The last bit of context for this theory is that it's not even new. The theory that the Jews of Eastern Europe came from the nomadic Khazars who had converted to Judaism was developed in 19th century Germany. If this is starting to sound similar to the Habaru theory, that's because it is. The Khazar theory was developed around the same time and was based on many of the anti-Semitic stereotypes that the Habaru theory was also built on. Unlike the Habaru theory, however, the Khazar theory has never had any serious acceptance within academia because there really just isn't any evidence to back it up. There's no historical evidence that any Turkic tribes in southern Russia had converted to Judaism. On top of that, there's another more widely accepted explanation for where Eastern European Jews came from, and that's that they came from Western Europe. We're going to cover this in a later episode, but the Middle Ages saw a lot of Jews driven out of Western Europe and into Eastern Europe, especially Poland, which was far more tolerant of Jews because one of their queens had been Jewish. This is a far more widely accepted theory for the origins of the Jews of Eastern Europe because there's actual evidence to back it up. Shlomo argues that the Khazar theory has been suppressed within academia, but in reality, the reason it's not accepted is because it's just a bad theory, and most historians reject it. Even Marxist Israeli historians reject this idea, and they accept a lot of anti-Semitic ideas. Now, this is not an exhaustive look at the origins of the Jews, but I hope this shows that there is a diversity of thought in this field and that there is still more room for research and debate. In the next episode, we are going to cover another unsettled question of Jewish history, and that is the historicity of the Exodus story. So make sure you click the subscribe button and the bell icon to make sure you don't miss that video when it comes out. If you're interested in learning more about this subject, I recommend that you read The Origins of the Jews, The Quest for Roots in a Rootless Age by Steven Weitzman. This book made this video possible, and so I have an affiliate link in the description to where you can buy it. Read it if you're interested in the subject. You won't regret it. If you're feeling generous, you can also donate on Patreon, where you can get perks such as seeing the videos early or having your name in the end credits of videos. Before I'm done, I just want to remind you to make sure you watch Mr. Beat's video on why the Jews have been hated throughout history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.